Hello and welcome. Fiona here. It's time for more innerVIVIDing, and I just invented that word. Last time around, we explored the idea that origin stories can be a big deal for humans all around the planet and why that might be. We also began to touch on the idea that for some people, origin stories can be contentious. Flying spaghetti monster? Thor and the world tree? Christians and their 7 days? Sometimes they can be a focus of disagreements. And what about our scientific worldview? Doesn't that mean letting go of these sometimes ancient origin stories, maybe? Or to put it another way,
if science can give us good theories about the origins of everything, why do humans persist with less scientific versions?
There is a yearning to sort of find out where you come from. And science helps to fill in that space, I suppose, where there's proof of things. But there's also, I think, a bit of a distance between that and the actual origin of things. And maybe we'll get there, but I think people want to fill that in. And I'm pretty certain that ancient peoples used stories and stuff to fill that in, why the sky is its colour, and where does the sun go, where does the moon come up from, those sorts of things.
There's a wisdom that our societies have drawn together for thousands of years into the spoken history, that actually the stories we keep speak more deeply than the process by which we're here, and they speak to the why of why we're here. And I think, you can reflect on that scientific event too, and just wonder and open up some of the same questions as well.
Well, I think our lives here on Earth is all about learning. And we continue to learn from the start until our lives end. And so we always try to find some answers to our being and to why things exist. Having both the creation story and the science story, I think, will help us to understand why we come to exist.
I don't think it's an either or. I think science is one way of explaining the world, and in some ways the language of mathematics is a language. So not everybody can access it, but it's a way of understanding things. Most of us, lesser beings, actually need narrative. And so I think one can inform the other in that kind of way. So I think it is that sense of we have language, and what's the language that everybody speaks? It may not be pure mathematics. If you want to articulate what the mathematical formula for the ever-expanding universe is, it's a long and complicated equation. But when we're using narrative, then there's another piece to that, which will be less precise, but probably easier to understand.
I think we do ask these questions. Why am I here? Why me of all these people? And why in this place at this time? And why am I the way that I am? And this is something that's been speaking a lot to me of late, but why am I someone with a hearing impairment? Or why am I someone maybe in a wheelchair? Or why am I, we call neurodivergent? Or why do I think differently? And I think creation stories can offer more expansion on those ideas, that maybe there's making meaning of those things and how they can help us to find purpose in our lives and find how we fit into the story of the world we live in. And I think science offers one story, and it's an important one, and I think it brings a lot of value, but it doesn't capture all of the human experience.
I don't think there's any difference between a scientific origin story and a story that's got another source to it. I think the Big Bang Theory is in fact an origin story, and it's even told in a way, even though it's science, it's told in a way that still connects us to the origins of time. And I suspect over time, the Big Bang Theory, which, by the way, was actually developed by a Jesuit priest who was also a physicist, I think that we will refresh that story over and over again, because the Big Bang Theory is very, if you like, scientific linear history. We also need to understand why, and other stories answer the why question. Science asks or answers the how question.
Okay, problem solved. That was close. But wait, is there more to this?
Well, I would first say that science is actually currently struggling with its theories of the origin of everything, at least when we're talking about the sort of biggest questions about the origin of the universe, whether there is even only one universe or whether there's multiple universes. So science itself doesn't have its own origin stories or its own origin theories kind of locked down and certain. We're actually living in an age in which scientific theories about the origins of everything is interestingly uncertain. So that's itself is very interesting. And yet, human beings persist with less than scientific theories about the origins of everything. I would say because those stories and those myths, they meet certain human needs for meaning making, for making sense of things that science doesn't, or that science can't, or that's not really the point of science. So for example, the creation myth in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, one of the things that creation story does is answer the question, is the world worthy of affirmation? And that story says, yes, it is. That's not something that science itself can directly say. It can describe all kinds of things for you, but that question, is it all worthy of saying yes to? Science itself doesn't answer that question. Or to take a different religious tradition, for instance, all the crazy and wild stories of Greek mythology, which has very interesting and fun and scandalous kind of origin stories about where it all comes from. One way to understand all those stories is that they're asking and answering the basic question, like, how do we make sense of a world that's at one and the same time full of both predictable and unpredictable forces? And how do we narrate that? How do we make sense of that? How do we find meaning in that world? And Greek mythology is one way of providing answers to those questions, which again, science itself doesn't do.
I remember when we would talk about science and religion when I was a high school chaplain, it was really important for us to think about how there's stories for different purposes. So I know that one of my colleagues would always use the story of, what happens when you put the kettle on. Where the molecules heat up and they bump into each other, etc. But then why do you put the kettle on? You might be saying, well, would you like a cup of tea? Or the analogy I would use was making a cake. You can read all about what temperature the oven needs to be and why each ingredient contributes to the cake as a whole. But it's much more interesting to think about how Grandma made the cake and how she made it for your birthday and what celebrations you shared when you ate the cake that Grandma made. So they're all stories. They're stories that explain things, but they are told for different reasons. I think science and religion are all part of the same making sense of who we are and why we are and how we are to live. And I found that by being a scientist, staring down the microscope, I was stunned by the wonder, and as electron microscopes developed, that we could see these absolutely tiny things, and then on completely the other end of the scale, people were exploring and seeing more and more through telescopes and through sending things into space that could film other bodies in the solar system and what the Earth looks like from afar. So at the very ends of what we as humans can see of creation, the tiniest thing and the largest thing, only ever fill everybody with wonder, whether you are a believer in a God of some kind or not. There's a sense of wonder and awe.
Okay, awe and wonder, I get. Answering different questions, I get. But is it still, consistent thinking? Or is there a more nuanced, maybe even balanced possibility? You can tell I think there is because I'm saying this, right? Alrighty then, there's lots to summarise. I just heard people saying scientific theory and origin stories have different purposes, different aims. Science, how did it happen? Origin stories, why did it happen? Or what does it mean that it happened? The key is people are complex beings and we want to know how and why, and also what does it mean? That seems like one of the most basic things about us as humans. We want things to make sense, especially when they don't. So origin stories can give comfort because they help things make sense. But that also helps us feel connected to the world and each other. They also give us wow moments. So maybe it's worth starting to think about where we stand with them, where you stand with them. Maybe. What do you think?